You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi, I'm Annie from the US.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. The podcast with 2 women, 4 dogs, and 3 common interests: murder, mystery, and the macabre throughout history.
That's right. Before we start, we want to give a quick shout out to our newest Patreon member. So I don't know if it's Stony Bass or Stony Bass. I don't know if you're stoned and play the bass, or you play the bass with stony vibes, or if you're an actual bass in a stony river. I'm fine either way. I think it's quite mysterious and has a lot of possibilities, and I enjoy that username very much.
Thank you so much for your support. Also, a quick shout out to Andrew W., who sent us an email a while ago. And I'm sorry, I meant to get back to you sooner. Thank you for your kind words. You have no idea how much they mean to me. Annie, I don't remember if I told you, Andrew is a friend of one of your friends and he lives in Jamaica Plain.
Yes, you forwarded me his email. He's friends with our friend Doyle. I was just with Doyle's lovely wife, Amy, when I got my ears pierced in JP as part of my midlife crisis that we had previously discussed. But that was such a nice email. And Andrew, we were really sorry to hear of the loss of your pets recently. We know how hard that is, and we thank you for listening.
If you want to know more about how to contact us or how to support the podcast, please listen until the end, because now it's time to get back to Jim Jones and the People's Temple. If you didn't listen to part 1 and 2 yet, we highly recommend you listen to these first, but it's not required, I'd say. It just gives you more of Jim Jones' background information. In part 1, we talked about his childhood, his family and upbringing. And in part 2, we covered his wedding and the beginning of his ministry, and of course the People's Temple and their relocation to California. But we also talked about the first cracks that showed the control, the paranoia, the fear of nuclear holocaust, and the sexual assault, misconduct, and possible money misappropriation. And that the People's Temple started to make headlines. When part 2 dropped last week, we had a listener reach out. Thank you so much, Laura. And she told me some of her family history and how her grandfather, who was a minister in Ukiah, California, where the People's Temple relocated to, had known Jim Jones and had actually tried to raise awareness that there was something bad going on. She also sent us a link to a letter her grandfather had written back in 1972. I asked her if we could share her comment and the article/letter she sent us, and she said yes. And the thing she commented on our Instagram was, quote, "Insanely enough, my grandfather knew Jim Jones, as he was a Baptist minister in Ukiah, California when he was there. He tried his best to alert authorities that he was dangerous and even wrote to the governor, but no one listened. It hurt him very deeply that he wasn't able to stop him. He publicly detailed his accusations both to raise awareness and for his own safety. Women from the temple then started dropping pies off at their house. They were very scared, but Granddad had strong convictions. My dad still remembers being told not to answer the door or eat the pies they delivered. It's a chilling story," end quote. And you know us, we looked up the articles in the San Francisco Examiner from that time to see if we could find out what this was all about. And thanks to Annie's wonderful newspaper archive subscription, we found something that's really interesting, I think.
Yeah, this is pretty interesting. It's a scary story. Can you imagine being the person warning everyone about this local cult, and then women from the cult start showing up with pies? No, thank you.
It's so ominous and weirdly passive-aggressive.
Yeah, it's a big nope. Nope. All right. This is the San Francisco Examiner, Wednesday, September 20th, 1972, page 1. Quote, "Probe asked of People's Temple by Reverend Lester Kingsolving, Examiner Religion Editor. The State Attorney General's office has been asked to investigate the People's Temple Christian Church in Redwood Valley, as well as the conduct of the church's attorney, Timothy O. Stoen, who is also Assistant District Attorney of Mendocino County. The written request was made by the Reverend Richard G. Taylor, who served as pastor of Ukiah's First Baptist Church for 6 years prior to his appointment in July as South Coastal Area Minister for the American Baptist Churches of the West. In his letter to Attorney General Evel J. Younger, the Reverend Mr. Taylor noted, quote,
And the Reverend Taylor is Laura's grandfather.
Is Laura's grandfather, that's right. And so he says, quote, in March of 1972, I requested that Sheriff Reno Bartolome ask the Attorney General's office to investigate the People's Temple, and in particular, the conduct of Timothy O'Stowen, attorney for the People's Temple. Prior to that, I asked Mendocino County District Attorney Duncan James about Stowen's conduct in connection with Maxine Harp, a suicide whose funeral service I conducted. I knew that Mrs. Harp had been connected with the People's Temple Christian Church of Redwood Valley, near Ukiah. I had been informed by Mr. Stowen that prior to her suicide, she had been engaged in counseling at the People's Temple, in which counseling Mr. Stowen had participated. Following Mrs. Harp's death, her sister informed me that unidentifiable persons from the People's Temple had occupied her sister's house and ransacked it. District Attorney James informed me that he had discussed the matter with Stowen, but no action was taken other than requesting Stowen to refrain from any further misuse of his office. A spokesperson for the Attorney General's office in San Francisco said that the requested investigation would be considered. In Ukiah, District Attorney James confirmed that the Reverend Mr. Taylor's statement that no action had been taken, but he otherwise declined to comment. But Under Sheriff Tim Shea firmly denied the claim of another of the People's Temple's 3 attorneys that the temple has armed guards at the sheriff's request. Redwood Valley attorney Eugene B. Chaikin wrote to the Examiner, saying, quote, Our local law enforcement agency has requested that we have trained persons carry firearms, and we have reluctantly acquiesced to the sheriff's request. End quote. But when this letter was quoted to Shea, the undersheriff replied, quote, That is an absolute untrue statement. We never made any such requests. When asked about the 4 armed guards, 3 pistols and a shotgun, spotted outside the People's Temple on Sunday morning, September 10th, Shea explained that this is a private property and people may carry firearms on private property provided the weapons are not concealed. End quote. In his letter, the Reverend Mr. Taylor also informed the Attorney General, quote, What is of utmost concern is the atmosphere of terror created in the community by so large and aggressive a group, which effect is implemented by Stowen's civil office. The People's Temple, I understand, employs armed guards contending that their pastor, the Reverend Jim Jones, has been threatened. From my experience, I seriously wonder if they have ever been threatened, and whether instead they have not contrived such reports in order to justify armed guards at their services, which attract crowds in excess of 1,000 people. I have counseled with one paroled inmate of a California correctional institution who was sponsored on parole by the People's Temple, but after he had lived for some time in Redwood Valley, he planned to move away. Here again, a group of men from People's Temple held him incommunicado for 4 hours, leaving him terrified. For those reasons, and because I sincerely believe more questionable activity is going on, I do request that your office conduct an investigation. End quote. Wow, your grandpa was a badass. Good work. Standing up for
100%,
people.
But I feel so bad for him. He tried to do the right thing and ultimately not only had to fear for his family's safety, for his own, but also for his family's safety. But also then, after the fact, after what ultimately happened, he felt probably heartbroken about how it all ended and that he wasn't able to stop it or do anything or that nobody listened.
Yeah. It's an awful situation to be in. And I think almost all of us, right, have been not in this particular situation, but in a situation where somebody we know and love has been taken in by a con artist, whether it's in a relationship or a business opportunity, or it happens all the time. And it's just so difficult and painful and terrifying when someone you love can't see that they're being manipulated. It's the worst.
And also, we shouldn't forget, we talked about it last week, Jim Jones had a lot of acquaintances in high places.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was really difficult to get him.
Yeah. He wasn't an easy person to take down.
No. I have to say that when we were looking for this article, I looked for some more from that time, so especially September 1972, because I wanted to know, was there more? And I found so many. The San Francisco Examiner wrote a lot about Jones at the time, and at one point even gave him the chance for an interview and to tell his point of view. And no worries, we won't read all of these articles to you, maybe to our patrons. I think that could be interesting. Let us know if you would be interested in a life with all these articles. But I will tell you something I didn't know until we researched this, until I looked into these articles. Remember last week when we mentioned that he tried this kind of spiritual faith healing in his temple and he really wasn't that good at it? Well, apparently not only faith healing, like making someone limp less down the aisle, you know what I mean? He actually claimed to have raised 43 people from the dead. Annie, did you know that?
No, I did not know also about the zombies until we started researching this. So I think you should tell us all more.
So I found this article in the Examiner from 17th of September 1972, and it says that, quote, "The prophet who raises the dead," and it's again by Reverend Lester Kinsolving. Redwood Valley. "A man they call the prophet is attracting extraordinary crowds from extraordinary distances to his People's Temple Christian Church in this Mendocino County hamlet. His followers say he can raise the dead. The PTC, so the People's Temple Christian Church, mimeographed newsletter recently described the resurrection of a Los Angeles man, and one director of the temple claims that the prophet has returned life to more than 40 persons." This description now.
This description is, listen, this is pretty great, y'all.
So that's
you don't want to miss
the direct quote from the People's Temple member.
Yeah.
So he says, quote, "More than 40 persons, people stiff as a board, tongues hanging out, eyes set, skin graying, and all vital signs absent," end quote.
They're not a little dead, y'all. They're a lot dead. Yeah.
Was it almost dead in Princess Bride?
I think, yeah.
For the most part dead, or something like that. For the most part dead.
Mostly dead.
Mostly dead. His congregations, mostly black, believe the prophet possesses other equally amazing powers. They come from all over the West, from as far away as San Francisco, Seattle, and Los Angeles to the temple 7 miles north of Ukiah, end quote. So there was a fleet of 11 Greyhound buses, and they were running almost non-stop to take people to the temple. Also, that article mentioned one of Jones's claims that some still take at face value, the thing where he claims that he was half Cherokee.
Right. Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any evidence supporting his claim. It just seems to be part of this broader strategy to establish himself as defender of oppressed communities. And he himself knows what it's like, because he's not just a white guy. Yeah. He's also Native American. I mean, again, we see that today. And the absence of documentation or any kind of genealogical proof just really suggests that this claim was more about him presenting himself in a certain way than his actual heritage.
Yeah. And that's also the reason why in part 1 I said that it's quite possible that the whole KKK thing with his father was blown out of proportion by him. I don't trust anything that he claims, I mean, obviously.
No.
But, yeah.
No, you can't believe a word he says.
Anyway, back to the fact that he apparently could raise the dead, which is obviously crazy. And of course, the newspaper didn't take it seriously. But they did give him the chance to tell his point of view in an interview printed 1 week later, on 24th of September 1972, titled Pastor's Own Story. Quote, "Let's say your friend Jim Jones, as he would prefer to be called, and somebody has just died in your temple and you have just laid hands on that person, seemingly expired remains with the hope of effecting a resurrection. What's your next move?" Jim Jones replies, "It's just spontaneous. I would say, 'This is Jim.' That's my title. No reverend or anything. 'This is Jim.' If it was someone I didn't know very well, I'd say pastor. I'd say, 'This is pastor.' But most of them had attended at least several times. I'd say, 'This is Jim. I love you.' When you feel something like this, what do you say? 'I love you. We need you. Your family needs you. We care. I'm giving you love.' It would never be any magic words, no magic little catechism. Next question is, what are you feeling at that time?" And he replies, "Deep concern, deep empathy. At first it frustrated me and I found that was the worst thing. The most important thing I found was that they must detect in their mind is calm." That makes no sense.
I know. None of what he says makes a lot of sense.
He loves to ramble, yeah.
He does.
You're going to be fine. You're going to be all right. It's fine. It's fine.
Right.
One thing that makes the temple different from other churches that practice spiritual healing, according to the pastor, is that members are encouraged to get medical exams yearly. If they can't pay for it, he says the temple pays. And once a person been raised from the apparently dead, the pastor, whose wife is a registered nurse, encourages them to see a doctor.
She's like, listen, you should probably see a professional about that, now that you've come back to life.
Reverend Jones is quoted as, "Many healing churches will not permit their people to go to a doctor, and they ding-dong all the time about medical science and the woes of it. I openly say, if you've got a spiritual healing, go get it confirmed. Keep on with the doctor. If it can stand the test of empiricism, fine. Certainly when you're hearing medical science of a man telling his heart when to die, there's a whole lot going on up here." He's pointing at his head here. "That we can use. We're only using about 5% of it. And I like to think of myself as a kind of a motivator. I think that'd be the fairest word for it." End quote.
He's like the worst motivational speaker in the world. He's like, listen, if someone's dead, all I have to do is, it's like keep cool and hope for the best, basically, back to the chinchillas. It's like keep a calm mind and just tell them I love them, and that will bring them back from the dead.
It's easy. They also ask him how is it possible that so many people die in his temple, which is a fair question, right? And he replies that the reason for that is that he has a reputation as a spiritual healer and a prophet, and so a lot of very old and very ill people travel to visit him. And I mean, okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
They also ask why he feels the need to have armed guards, and he of course says, it's not that I want armed guards, it's that my board and my members fear for my safety.
Yeah, I'm not buying that one, but the whole thing about people dying does make a lot of sense, right? It's like the same reason some churches are known as plague churches, because word would spread there was a curative something at that church, and now they've got really impressive ossuaries and graveyards because so many people made a pilgrimage there to die there. So that's not new, and I'm sure Jim Jones also understood that as a it almost makes you wonder if he started doing the faith healing as a way to bring more terminally ill people to him.
I mean, that gives a lot of donations.
That's right. A lot of money.
Things that you can inherit. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So we have sexual assault and misconduct with the church members. We've got allegations of pocketing church money. We have some very suspicious transfers of properties from church members to the People's Temple. And we have former members now speaking out and talking about receiving beatings and being pressured by Jones and other members. And then we have Jim Jones, already really deep in his paranoia and power trip. And he's telling followers that all of this, all the negativity, is a conspiracy against him, and that the government wants to destroy him and the temple because of his socialist ideas and his support of the civil rights movement. And to be fair, I mean, that's not entirely crazily far-fetched in general, right? We know that governments often don't love opposing ideas, but I think we can all agree that in this particular case, it truly was just Jones's attempt to keep the situation under control, keep the people under control, and keep his followers loyal to him and on his side. And yeah, a lot of people believed the lies and the manipulation. We have here some excerpts from letters of support that were sent to the San Francisco Examiner, and these are parts of letters that were printed on Sunday, August 14th, 1977, on page 17. From Carol, quote, "This is why I have stuck with the People's Temple and Pastor Jim Jones, because of the goodness I've seen done for oppressed peoples. I wanted my children to be equal with all people and not have to grow up hating another because of their color, background, or religion. Here at People's Temple, they have that chance." End quote. And Harold wrote, quote, "Jim Jones is a deeply compassionate human being who has taken on cases and situations no one else would handle. Long-term drug addicts, youths with severe behavioral problems, older people by the score who were neglected in every way for years." End quote. From Jean, quote, "The insight with which people here attempt to meet life and to deal with and share each other's problems could not possibly be a reflection of a leader who is power-hungry or controls the lives of his flock. Numerous individuals, too many to even give an estimate, have been salvaged from wretched and unbearable conditions which seemed impossible to remedy." end quote. And Patty says, quote, "The work People's Temple is doing is not only saving tax dollars, but saving lives as well, and saving people from the ravages of crime, racism, terrorism, and vandalism have all been reduced by the work of the People's Temple in the community," end quote. So there are more of these, but it really goes to show that the people, the members of the People's Temple, they were in it for the right reasons. They were in it for a good cause. These weren't just crazy, delusional people. They were people just like us who saw an opportunity to live in a more equitable society. And they were taken in and taken over slowly.
Yeah, definitely.
And so we mentioned earlier about how Jim became more and more erratic and paranoid from the early 70s forward. And we think that's when he started to lean very heavily into drugs. Jim Jones's drug abuse didn't start overnight. In the early years of the People's Temple, there were no widespread reports of using drugs. However, as the temple grew, so did the pressures on Jones, and he began to experience health issues, including chronic insomnia, anxiety, and various stress-related ailments. To manage these conditions, Jones started using prescription drugs. Initially, it was just about finding relief, but over time, he escalated into abuse. He began taking increased doses and combining different substances, leading to severe dependence. So what kind of drugs did Jones use? He relied heavily on stimulants, particularly amphetamines, to stay awake and maintain his high energy levels. Amphetamines are powerful stimulant drugs that affect the central nervous system. They increase the levels of neurotransmitters in the brain, particularly dopamine and norepinephrine, leading to heightened alertness, concentration, and energy. Medically, amphetamines are prescribed for conditions like ADHD, narcolepsy, which is a sleep disorder, and medications like Adderall and Dexedrine are common examples of these. They can also be used short-term to help with weight loss by reducing appetite.
Not recommended.
Yeah, no. Yeah, if you've seen Requiem for a Dream, you would remember that. But I think that was basically what all of the 80s pills, 80s diet pills were,
yeah.
Right? Diet pills in the 80s were just speed. So there were a lot of people. It's funny because I'm on them now. I just recently started them for my recently diagnosed ADHD. And the crazy thing is, if you have ADHD, they don't actually make you feel alert. They make you feel calm. So that's always wild. But yeah, you got to be careful of abusing those kind of drugs.
But I have an interesting side note here. Many of you might know, but maybe some don't. During World War II, the German military widely distributed a methamphetamine-based stimulant known as Pervitin. It is also colloquially called Panzerschokolade, so tank chocolate, or Göring-Pillen, after Hermann Göring. Pervitin was adopted by the German military and distributed in large quantities to soldiers. The primary reason to do that was its effect of alertness and endurance. Pervitin helped soldiers to stay awake and alert for extended periods, which was obviously particularly useful during long missions or periods of intense combat, and the stimulant effects improved soldiers' endurance and reduced their needs for rest, allowing them to perform better under the stressful conditions of war. Additionally, the mood-elevating effects of Pervitin helped boost morale among the troops, though sometimes it led to overconfidence and very risky behavior. However, the widespread use of Pervitin came with very significant long-term consequences, as you might be able to imagine. Many soldiers became dependent on the drug, experiencing withdrawal symptoms when they couldn't access it, and the prolonged use led to severe health problems, including cardiovascular issues, psychological disturbances, and extreme fatigue once the effects were off. And while Pervitin provided short-term benefits, its long-time effects often reduced soldiers' overall combat effectiveness. Despite these downsides, the drug was particularly notable during the early years of the war, including the rapid and intense Blitzkrieg campaigns. The Pervitin enabled German soldiers to maintain the relentless pace of these offensives. And, fun fact, it wasn't just frontline soldiers who used Pervitin. Pilots, tank crews, and even factory workers, so civilians involved in war production, were given the drug to enhance their performance and endurance.
It's crazy to think about all of that when I know that I don't think the German army was the only army to do that, but I don't know enough about what I'm talking about to say anything else. I just don't think it was just the Germans, was it? I think a lot of armies. I don't know. Yeah. But when abused, these amphetamines, they can cause really serious psychological issues, including paranoia and hallucinations. And chronic use can cause long-term changes in brain function, leading to a dangerous cycle of dependency and escalating use. And so that's why, since the 1970s, amphetamines have been classified as Schedule II controlled substances in the United States. This classification was established by the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, and it indicated that they have a high potential for abuse, but it also means that they've accepted medical uses with severe restrictions. Stimulants that Jones was taking definitely contributed to his erratic behavior and delusions of grandeur. In order to try to counteract the effects of the stimulants and to manage his anxiety, Jones then took sedatives and tranquilizers, leading to a dangerous cycle of using uppers and downers, which we've discussed before, especially in our Jimi Hendrix, episode. There were also reports that Jones experimented with other psychoactive drugs, which would further complicate his mental state. And we're definitely going to talk more about this next week when we get into part 4, because there's just no denying how Jones's drug use escalated the entire situation in Guyana. Guyana? I hear it both ways. How do you say it?
I say it Guyana because that's how we say it here.
Guyana, yeah, Guyana. I keep hearing Guyana and Guyana.
I also hear it both ways in English.
Yeah. So under the influence of drugs, Jones's behavior became even more unpredictable. He made impulsive decisions that often had dire consequences for his followers. His drug-induced paranoia led him to believe that various entities, including the U.S. government, the media, and former temple members, were all plotting against him. And it was exactly this fear which fueled his desire to isolate the community in Guyana and enforce strict control over his followers.
Yeah, I think it's time to talk about the move to Guyana. As we said before, the media began to investigate the People's Temple more closely. Journalists and former members started to speak out, bringing to light disturbing stories of abuse, manipulation, and financial exploitation. These exposés painted a picture of a community under very tight control, with Jones at the helm, exerting an almost tyrannical authority over his followers. And one of the most significant blows came from an article published in New West magazine in August of 1977 with an article titled Inside People's Temple. The New West article was written by Marshall Kilduff and Phil Tracy. And the piece detailed numerous allegations against Jones and the temple, including physical and emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and extreme disciplinary measures. This article and others like it finally caught the attention of both the public and law enforcement agencies. The article starts with painting the picture of Jim Jones as this absolutely beloved figure, loved by his church members, charismatic and personal acquaintance of many political leaders in California. Quote, "To many, the Reverend Jim Jones is the epitome of a selfless Christian." End quote. But it soon turns really dark. Quote, "We began getting phone calls from former temple members. At first, while insisting on anonymity, the callers volunteered background about Jim Jones's cruelty to congregation members, in addition to making several other specific charges. We told the callers that we were not interested in such anonymous whispers, but then a number of them called back and agreed to meet in person, to be photographed, and to tell their attributed stories for publication. Based on what these people told us, life inside People's Temple was a mixture of Spartan regimentation, fear, and self-imposed humiliation. As they told it, the Sunday services to which dignitaries were invited were orchestrated events. Actually, members were expected to attend services 2, 3, even 4 nights a week, with some sessions lasting until daybreak. Those members of the temple's governing council, called the Planning Commission, were often compelled to stay up all night and submit regularly to catharsis, an encounter process in which friends, even mates, would criticize the person who was on the floor. In the last 2 years, we were told these often humiliating sessions had begun to include physical beatings with a large wooden paddle and boxing matches in which the person on the floor was occasionally knocked out by opponents selected by Jones himself. Also, during regularly scheduled family meetings, attended by up to 1,000 of the most devoted followers, as many as 100 people were lined up to be paddled for such seemingly minor infractions as not being attentive enough during Jones's sermons. Church leaders also instructed certain members to write letters incriminating themselves in illegal and immoral acts that never happened. It sounds very much like Scientology.
It does.
In addition, temple members were encouraged to turn over their money and property to the church and live communally in the temple buildings. Those who didn't ran the risk of being chastised severely during the catharsis sessions, end quote.
Yeah, that's very reminiscent of our last topic with the mutual criticism at Guiteau's stay at the Bible communism community of Oneida, but without all the free love and sexy time.
Yeah.
And eugenics.
So in the article, a lot of ex-members speak out, for example, how their teenage daughter was beaten more than 70 times. And the reason was that she had kissed and hugged a female friend she hadn't seen in a long time, and they called her a lesbian and peddled her in front of the whole congregation.
Oh, man. It's like, yeah, they're for equality, but here's the rub. There are still restrictions.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Or then there's this part in the article, quote, Laura Cornelius was one of the privates in the People Temple's army. She was in the temple about 5 years before leaving in 1975, just one of dozens of elderly black grandmothers who attended each meeting at the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission that Jim Jones chairs. The first thing that bothered her was the constant requests for money. After I was in some time, she says, it was made known to us that we were supposed to pay 25% of our earnings, the usual sum according to practically all the former members that we interviewed. It was called the commitment. For those who could not meet the commitment, she says, there were alternatives like baking cakes to sell at Sunday service or donating the jewelry. He said that we didn't need the watches. My best watch, she recalls sadly. He said we didn't need homes. Give the homes, furs, all of the best things you own. Some blacks gave out of fear that they could end up in concentration camps. The money was needed, she was told, to build up this other place, so we would have some place to go whenever they, the fascists in this country, were going to destroy us like they did the Jews, Jones said. That they would put black people in concentration camps and that they would do us like the Jews in the gas ovens. The final straw, she says, came the night Jones brought a snake into the service. Viola, she was up in age in her 80s and she was so afraid of snakes, and he held the snake close to her chest and she just sat there and screamed. And he still held it there, end quote.
That's awful. It's awful. I think that last example really shows you Jim's true nature, the greediness and the sadism, right? Because he's definitely enjoying the suffering of others now and the control he has over people.
What are your thoughts on the people who did the corporal punishment? Well, I get there are a lot of people in these situations who are too scared to speak up or have already invested too much to admit that this is all fucked up, like the sunken cost fallacy.
Yeah.
But to be actively participating in this vile behavior, what do you think? How do they justify it for themselves?
I don't know.
I know. They think they are doing it for the right reasons, right?
Yeah.
But somewhere, when they're lying awake late at night, they have to know how vile they act, or?
I would hope so. I mean, it's the same way I think about people in the KKK. It's the same way I think about people who were in... Whoa.
What's going on?
Do you hear that?
Yeah? What was that?
That was loud thunder. That's why my head's been so bad. That startled me. It's the same way I wonder about, people who worked closely with Hitler, people who worked in concentration camps, people who did experiments on people. Like, how does anybody get there? Are they going along because they're afraid for their lives, for their families' lives? Do they really believe? It's one of the things that draws us back to stories like this, because how? How does it happen, right?
You don't attend, for example, here. You don't go in one night to this nice, friendly church for the first time and they just put a paddle in your hand and say, well, now beat up that person. I think it's such a slow progress. Like if you're they always make this comparison in a lot of situations with the frogs in the boiling pot.
Right, yeah.
If you put them in the cold water and then you start boiling the water, they don't really, you get used to it.
They don't try to hop out.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I think that had to be a huge part of it, right? And I don't think there's any coincidence that Jim Jones, who I think probably was admirer of Hitler's, certainly his charisma and leadership skills, if you can take those wholly separate from the terrible person he was, which we have to when we look at these certain things, right? Because not everybody not everybody has it in them to become a terrible leader. You have to have a certain amount of charisma. And I just find it so interesting that he was using Hitler's tactics as threats to keep people in line. Like, he knew what he was doing.
Oh, he took inspiration from a lot of places. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the article also states, quote, why Jim Jones should be investigated. It is literally impossible to guess how much money and property people gave Jim Jones in the 12 years since he moved his People's Temple to California. Some, like Laura Cornelius, gave small things like watches or rings. Others, like Walt Jones, sold their homes and gave the proceeds to the temple. According to nearly all the former temple members that we have spoken with, extensive, continuous pressure was put on members to deed their homes to the temple. Many complied. A brief reading of the records on file at the Mendocino County Recorder's Office shows that some 30 pieces of property were transferred from individuals to the temple during the years 1968 to 1976. Nearly all these parcels were recorded as gifts. Interestingly, several of the gifts were signed or recorded improperly, end quote.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
So the heat around Jim Jones and the People's Temple was amping up, and the increasing public criticism and legal threats put Jones on really high alert.
Feeling this heat, Jones knew he needed a place where he and his followers could continue their mission without the prying eyes of the media and the interference of the government. His thoughts turned to a remote jungle settlement in Guyana, which had been in the works since 1973. The land for what should become the infamous Jonestown had been purchased in the early 1970s, but it wasn't until the media scrutiny and legal pressures intensified in the mid-1970s that Jones decided to expedite the move. Guyana, with its socialist government and remote jungle landscape, seemed like the perfect refuge. By relocating, Jones hoped to escape the jurisdiction of the United States authorities and create a self-sufficient community free from external scrutiny. So he just wants to go away and do whatever he wants without anyone to tell him no, basically. The decision to move to Guyana was driven by a desire to preserve Jones's vision and to protect him from the mounting pressures in the U.S. It was a bold and desperate move, reflecting the growing paranoia and sense of impending doom that had begun to consume Jones. So Guyana it was. The question, or at least it was a question for me, why exactly did Jim Jones choose Guyana as the new home for his followers? The decision to move the People's Temple wasn't made lightly. Several factors influenced Jones's choice, each contributing to his vision of creating a utopian community free from external interference.
So, yeah, as you said, he just wanted a place where he can be the ruler of all.
Yeah, he just wants to be king of the castle, and he doesn't want anyone else to tell him anything. So now we're going to break down a few of the key reasons behind this decision. First and foremost, Guyana's political climate played a major role. In the early 1970s, Guyana was under the leadership of Prime Minister Forbes Burnham, who had established a socialist government. This political alignment resonated with Jim Jones's own socialist ideals and provided a sense of ideological compatibility. Jones believed that a socialist country would be more supportive of his community goals and less likely to interfere with their way of life. The geographical location of Guyana was another critical factor. Situated in the northeastern part of South America, Guyana offered a remote and isolated setting far from the reach of American authorities. This isolation was crucial for Jones, who was increasingly paranoid about government scrutiny and media investigation into his activities. By moving to a remote jungle, Jones hoped to shield his followers from external pressure and maintain tighter control over the community. He doesn't want any of his followers reading these articles that, hey, maybe they're being taken advantage of. Furthermore, Guyana's government was receptive to the idea of welcoming the People's Temple. The country was in dire need of economic development and saw the potential benefits of having an organized group like the People's Temple establish an agricultural project in the jungle. The promise of investment and development in a remote part of the country was appealing to Guyanese officials who were eager to promote growth and modernization. So you can absolutely understand that too. Like, it's not a surprise that they were able to do this where they were able to do this, right? And then another factor influencing the choice was that Guyana had pretty lenient immigration policies. Unlike a lot of other countries, Guyana allowed the People's Temple to bring in a large number of American citizens without any real stringent restrictions. And this was vital for Jones, who planned to relocate hundreds of his followers to the new settlement. Finally, and one of the official reasons, something that he did sell his followers on, was the vision of creating a utopian community that was deeply ingrained in Jones's philosophy. He believed that by moving to Guyana, he could establish a model society based on socialist principles, free from the racial and social injustice prevalent in the United States. This idealistic vision attracted many of his followers, who saw the move as a chance to build a new life in a harmonious and egalitarian community.
Yeah, and I get that. Those were people who were discriminated against in the United States, who saw absolutely no way of living an equal life.
That's right.
And I think it's easier for them to be convinced to go to a country far away, to leave everything behind.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So in 1973, Jones and several members of his inner circle visited Guyana to scout potential locations for their new settlement. And they were very impressed by the country's lush landscape and the possibilities it offered for self-sufficiency through agriculture. And in 1974, the People's Temple leased a large tract of land in the jungle from the Guyanese government. And the goal was to establish an agricultural commune where the temple members could live in peace, away from the prying eyes of American authorities. And this settlement, as we said before, would soon be known as Jonestown. Unfortunately, the name would become synonymous with the absolute horror of the mass murder of over 900 people, and not for being a socialist paradise.
Yeah. Now, how do you move almost 1,000 people to another continent?
That's quite a task.
Yeah. And the initial group that was sent there consisted of a small team of pioneers tasked with preparing the land for an arrival of the larger group. These early settlers faced enormous challenges, including clearing dense jungle, constructing basic facilities, and starting agricultural products. The conditions were harsh and the work was grueling, but their efforts were crucial in laying the groundwork for what was to come. By 1977, when the pressure on Jim Jones and the People's Temple in the United States had intensified, and faced with growing legal and public scrutiny, Jones decided it was time to relocate the majority of his followers to Guyana. The move was obviously a massive logistical undertaking. Hundreds of temple members began the journey to Guyana, leaving behind their homes, jobs, and families. They traveled in waves, departing from various locations in the United States. They typically flew to the capital city of Georgetown, and from there they traveled by bus to the remote location where Jonestown was being established in the jungle. The journey to Jonestown was arduous and involved navigating through challenging terrain once they arrived in Guyana. This logistical operation was coordinated by the People's Temple leadership to relocate hundreds of members to their new settlement in the South American jungle.
Can you imagine how daunting it must have been to adapt to life in a remote jungle? We shouldn't forget that we're not only talking about young, healthy, strong people. Many of the members were already elderly. There were health issues. I have looked up some demographical stats for Jonestown. It's from jonestown.sdsu.edu. Did you know, for example, that there were almost twice as many women there than there were men, which I found interesting. There were approximately 1,020 members living in Guyana in 1978. And it was 68% black people, 24% white people, 5% mixed, and we have 3% other. And this is a quote from the webpage I mentioned before, the jonestown.sdsu. Quote, 131 children were under the age of 10. 234 were between the ages of 10 and 19. And 186 were in their 20s. This means that more than one half of the residents were under 30, and more than 1/3 were under 20. While many teenagers worked in Jonestown to support the project, these figures nevertheless reveal a relatively large non-productive population. 211 people were 60 and older, with 3/4 of this segment being black females. While the number of seniors may indicate a sizable non-productive workforce in the community, they nevertheless played an important role in supporting Jonestown through their monthly social security checks. End quote.
I thought it was kind of weird at first that like every article that we read at that time makes a note of how many Black women are in his congregation. But I guess it just goes to show how unusual that would have been at that time.
Yeah, because I think it was such a large number. Like there was such an, how do you say that?
Yeah, there was just a very large following of older Black women who were probably just sick of all the bullshit. You know, they'd been around long enough to be really fed up with it. Yeah, I get it. I totally get it.
I mean, who would have been a very discriminated group?
Yeah. Overlooked. Yeah, absolutely. So Jim Jones and his family, they were, of course, among the last to move. They arrived in Guyana in 1977, and Jones's arrival marked a significant shift in the dynamic at Jonestown. While the initial settlers had worked tirelessly to establish the community, Jones's presence brought an intensified level of control and surveillance. He implemented strict rules and conducted frequent loyalty tests to ensure the devotion of his followers. Life in Jonestown was challenging. It was hard. Settlers faced a tropical climate with high humidity and heavy rainfall. The isolation from the outside world, combined with the demanding agricultural work, took a toll on the residents. Despite these hardships, many temple members remained committed to Jones's vision of a socialist utopia. And the move to Guyana was not without its difficulty and controversies. There were reports of mistreatment, lack of medical care, and inadequate food supplies. Despite these issues, Jones maintained a tight grip on the community, using a combination of charisma, fear, and manipulation to keep his followers in line. And again, that is one of the points in this whole story where many people ask, well, if everything was so horrible, why did they stay? And there were a few reasons, but the number one reason would be it was better than what they had experienced back home in the United States. It gave them a chance to build a new life. There were a lot of hardships in Guyana, but they weren't based on the color of their skin.
And I think they at least had the hope that things would get better once they settled down, once they have everything up and running.
That's right. And they were working toward something that they believed in. You know what I mean?
I think none of them feared hard work.
No, not at all. Not at all. The other aspect of it is when things did start to go bad and some of them did start to get disillusioned, what were they supposed to do? Where were they supposed to go? They lived in the middle of fucking nowhere. They're in the jungle. They have no personal belongings. They don't have any money of their own. Did we talk about the fact that I believe Jim had control of everybody's passport, was kept?
Oh, yeah, I think he did. We didn't mention that yet.
Yeah, I think they didn't have their passports.
Didn't they find all the passports later?
Yeah, I think they were all, yeah, I think so.
I think I saw a photo of that, yeah.
Yeah, but they had nothing and they had nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And nowhere to go there even if they could. You know what I mean? They were completely trapped there and under his control, and some of them started to realize it. And this is probably a good place to stop for the week because next week we have so much to talk about. The events that led up to the absolutely horrible, horrible happenings on the 18th of November, 1978, the massacre itself and the aftermath. And we'll discuss our own grievances with this whole thing a bit more next week.
Yeah.
Yeah? Do you have something good?
I think last week I told you all that my husband was home for 10 days vacation. And while every time he's on vacation, it's obviously amazing and great and I love it, it's also the time where I never do any exercise. And I'm at this point where I'm starting to miss it when I don't do it for a couple of days. And so yesterday I got back into it. I started running again yesterday, and today I went to the gym and I felt amazing. Really good. Really, really good. And that's my something good for this week.
That is something good.
How about you?
Mine is, I guess mine is that I'm actually starting to feel a little better. If you haven't been able to tell from my voice from the last couple of episodes, I returned from my vacation with the nieces and nephew and also brought COVID home with me. So I was glad that it wasn't as serious as it was a few years ago. But man, it still knocked me on my ass and I'm finally feeling better. Like I'm recovering for it, not from it, not in it anymore. So at least I don't have to worry about it for my next trip. I'm trying to just stay positive, you know? It was pretty unpleasant. Yeah, I had a fever of like 102 and it just felt like all of my bones were on fire. And I was just saying to Johanna, I'm still weirdly aware of my entire, I don't know how to explain it except to say that I'm very aware of my respiratory system. Everything is kind of uncomfortable when I breathe, but everything's fine. It's just...
Yeah, it really takes a while. Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry about the... I always feel like I sound a little bit like a 1-900 operator when my voice drops like this. Like, hello. It's my Hallmark After Dark voice. So
I think you sounded great. It's like this episode of Friends when Phoebe gets the flu. And all of a sudden
I
she's
love
singing
Phoebe so much.
Very seductively.
Yes. Yeah. This is so good.
All right. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our other episodes, please do us the huge favor, go to your podcast app and leave us a rating and or review. It helps us with the algorithm, it helps other people find us, and it also helps to boost our morale.
It does. You're the reason we keep doing this.
Of course. If you would be interested in joining our Patreon, that's the kind of things that keep the lights on over here and pays, for example, for the newspaper archive and these kind of things. Please check out patreon.com, search Fresh Hell Podcast, and we'll pop right up. And we just had a lovely get-together again, and the dates for the next ones are going to be up soon, and you can rewatch everything. There's a lot of private photos and videos and these kind of things on there. It's a very eclectic compilation of our lives.
Yeah, definitely.
And please check out our webpage, freshhellpodcast.com. There you find the links to everything. Our email address is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. There you can reach us. And we also have a PO box. You find that on the webpage. Join our Facebook. It's still the best group on the internet. We promise. And I think that's it, right?
I think that's it, yeah.
Please tell all your pets we said hi, hug them, cuddle them, kiss them. Treat them as well as you can. No, treat them always like 110%.
That's right.
And be kind to them. Be kind to your fellow human being. You know, not if they're real assholes, but the average person out there who's just stressed about life. And the most important part, be kind to yourself.
That's right. It's the hardest sometimes, isn't it? So, as we always like to close the show with, my favorite Churchill quote from the Second World War, which is, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
See you next week.